Isles of the Emberdark is the latest release from Bibbidi-Bop Stiggity-Biggle, and quite the interesting solidification of where the Cosmere is going in terms of its long-term development, straight up addressing some of the big implications that we got from this more medium stakes journey within the Cosmere, which in itself could almost be not entirely accurate. I don't think this is, in terms of for the characters on the page, a medium stakes story within the Cosmere, but for us, the reader, compared to what's come before and what we know the Cosmere contains, does not feel nearly as big and bombastic. Let's get into it. The story follows Starling's POV as she manages a crew that's caught up in a rather ambitious squadron, now actually assigned in a post out within the Cosmere's ambition, and as well as Six of Dusk, a local native on the planet who is forced to deal with not only his own growing irrelevance to the culture he has been such a part of for such a long time, but begin to act as a guide or a mediator even for the forces that exist within the Cosmere that his culture and whole society is going to be caught in the wakes of. And that's kind of what I mean by it feeling like a more medium stakes journey for the Cosmere as a whole, and how Isles of the Emberdark is specifically setting up some really big implications for the future of what Sanderson's trying to build here, but we'll get more into that later. Let's talk about this direct story. And this shouldn't surprise anybody who's been consuming the secret projects from Sanderson, but my favorite aspect to Isles of the Emberdark was the environment work. I think the creation of this specific resource on this planet that is so heavily tied into an environment that could end up playing a major role into the wider conflicts of the Cosmere was a rich crop in terms of what it was able to provide for this story and its themes. And it also justified a corner of the Cosmere that should almost feel like a forgotten throwaway space, becoming a linchpin that ends up getting so much attention from these larger forces. Six of Dusk's people are now in contact with the people from above, the space age further down the road future for the two main Cosmere worlds we are familiar with, Roshar and Skog. And there seems to be a bit of a cold war happening between these two players where they're constantly trying to vie for an advantage over the other through proxy wars with smaller acts of domination in these worlds that Six of Dusk is a part of, which takes on a pretty heavy idea and theme that early on in this book I was surprised to see taken on, and that is, of course, colonialism, which leads into Six of Dusk's own arc of seeing his people progress and his role in society begin to fade away. How much can you preserve your culture when there are these outside forces that, not quite at gunpoint, are forcing you to more be caught up in their way of life, their values, and choose a side.
Choose a side or die.
In this conflict that really you should not have a dog in. But this environment that allows travel through the Cosmere in a more efficient, less costly way than the already established routes that this world lies host to is such a, I don't want to say Lovecraftian, but bordering into that territory, horrific realm where there are these manifestations of fears and things that, yeah, make it believable that even in this further futuristic age, it becomes extremely hard for even an advanced society to be able to navigate. And with Dusk's people being those that have been thriving in this environment for so long, all of it just adds up to make complete sense and is actually one of my favorite, if not my favorite, conflict of any of the
secret projects.
And adding into this even more is a cast of characters that range from really solid concept to good characterization. Nothing here was boring or forgettable, but none of these characters are going to be in my top 20 Cosmere characters. My favorite, though, is an intelligence that I can't describe as a hive mind intelligence, so I will instead say is a network intelligence. And we see how really all these different alien species coming together to exist in this really diverse, diffuse environment that this entire epic series is becoming, creates conflict that just, of course, feels oh so familiar to what we know in our world, all playing into that theme of colonialism that Sanderson is taking on unblinking full front with this story. And I actually want to take a moment here to praise specifically, again, the thematic work going on in Isles of the Emberdark, because I genuinely think it's some of the best we've seen from Sanderson in a long time. Because not only do we have colonialism explored in a surprisingly realistic way from Sanderson, I was afraid with how he's handled some social commentary in the past, there might be some pulled punches in terms of the ramifications for Dusk's culture encountering these forces of the universe at this point, with how far we've seen Sklatha and Roshar grow. There's not a simple, clean answer provided of, yeah, your society and culture's safe and fine. Don't worry, nothing's gonna change. Because name one time in history where a culture coming in contact with a technologically advanced other has not caused radical change. That's how I'll put that. And so there is a follow through with that idea. And at the same time, it parallels our co-main characters' internal developed conflict of even before all of these things with and Roshar are developed, we see internally Dusk is already battling with the idea, the fact that his specific role within his people is already going the way of the dodo, and that's before these more substantial tides come in. And the way that's executed doesn't entirely pull its punches in terms of having a more down-to-earth result where there isn't just some cushy landing, and instead there's an optimistic one, which plays in very well with the other co-main characters' just general demeanor. And while I don't think anything said within this book is mind-blowingly profound, it's just all really well done. For example, the quote-unquote primitive culture, as it's viewed by the technologically superior ones, is actually given like agency of its own. It has an independent history. There are changes happening within it regardless of what is going on in the wider Cosmere. And that's the advantage you get when you have an experienced culture builder like Sanderson come in to tackle a theme like colonialism. He's absolutely not going to miss the opportunity to develop and flesh out a culture, because I imagine, like most fantasy authors, that's a hell of a lot of fun and ends up just giving you a more freedom to actually execute these colonialist themes. This all feels really well balanced and planned out in a way that I'm excited to see for a standalone entry for this sci-fantasy step for the Cosmere, which takes me nicely to my next point, which is this is the sci-fantasy throne. I don't know what I drew here either, but there's not really a current reigning king of science fantasy. Book of the New Sun had its time. Star Wars is what it is. Dune certainly had its reigning moment as well. But as it sits right now, I was thinking about this. I can't really think of a king or queen of science fantasy. And if the Cosmere is shifting to have this blend of the genres be its future, with all of the free work and momentum it got from its fantasy origins, the sci-fantasy growth we're about to see could easily plant Sanderson, if he's not already, as the king of sci-fantasy writing right now, almost by default. I mean, think of a single author who is as commercially successful as Sanderson operating in the sci-fantasy space that's not just tied into a massive corporate franchise like Warhammer or Star Wars. He might just walk in on that throne and sit down and say, man, sci-fantasy ruler of this era. Because I don't personally think Sanderson's going to go down as the greatest fantasy author of this era, but he certainly has a shot of going down as the greatest sci-fantasy author of this era. I, as someone who has been experimenting more with sci-fantasy recently in my own personal reading life, am glad to see it, because I would love to see more readers be open to the idea of exploring sci-fantasy as avidly as they typically do fantasy or science fiction. And hopefully it can also do away with, at least a little bit, Star Wars being the preconceived default notion of what sci-fantasy is, which in my opinion can be a bit constraining. But all right, that's all more stuff for later. Let's get into what made Isles of the Emberdark actually turn out to probably be my favorite of the secret projects. As a Brandon Sanderson fan, I also think this was a bit of an ambitious story for him to take on, with how much it didn't rely on his strengths outside of just, of course, crafting an interesting environment that plays into a lot of the conflicts he's making. Because this is a story that does not have a Sanderlanche. Granted, there is, of course, a climax action sequence at the end, but it never grows beyond just this kind of bubble conflict that we are sat in the middle of. And instead, this relies a lot more on characters not necessarily politically maneuvering with each other, but relying on manipulation and trying to move pieces on a board to get an outcome they desire. And so it ends up feeling like you have 4 players sitting down at a chess game, and everyone has their own line trying to, of course, achieve the outcome they want. And the way the story gets to the ending it desires, I found to be really satisfying. There were a couple of convenient moments and maybe one bit of an antagonist acting a bit
rather stupid.
But aside from that, especially how certain beats relied on exploiting the fact that perhaps those societies that have developed more into the sci-fi space have yet to fully understand some of the magical environments around them, provided loopholes for our characters to step into. And all of that came together for something that made sense, beat to beat. I think structurally was immensely satisfying, and also fully fleshed out 2 sides coming against the colonizing force with deeply different motivations and desired outcomes, yet figuring out a way to work together because they understand what an overwhelming force is compared to their lot in this growing, coming conflict. In fact, I would say what ended up being the unifier for our protagonist was kind of just the fact that they were both coming from an underdog place. We have the culture that is having this looming shadow slowly move over them as they're being ushered into the Cosmere, and then we have the people who are just trying to get by and make a living for themselves while this conflict is going on. On the grand scheme of things, there are going to be downtrodden on this from all angles, and it's an interesting new perspective because before we've only ever sat with the heroes for the main Cosmere stories, and so it makes you kind of think about, you know, maybe not all the common people loved Dalinar and all the stuff that was going on. I don't know, maybe I'm going too far into it now. But I also like that the ending of the story, well, it was very sweet for a lot of the characters, ended up not being totally sweet, all problems solved for the people that Dusk is a part of. It doesn't go the easy cop-out way of fully isolationist without ever having to address the conflicts of the future, and instead, it becomes about leverage, as is often the case with resources and environments where treaties are possibly holding back massive military action. How you are able to leverage small advantages or things within your society outsiders need, as you look at history in the real world, can either make or break the longevity of a culture and the safety of the culture that Dusk was already a part of that was dying isn't somehow enshrined to forever be protected, but instead Isles of the Emberdark acknowledges that unfortunately cultures do die. They have to change, they have to evolve, but it becomes more about preserving what truly means a lot to you and limiting how much outside influences can dictate what you end up sacrificing for the greater good. Because of course, if it's left to the outside, you'll lose everything and just be assimilated because that's what's easy for the colonizing force. And tying back into having these magical forces from across the Cosmere blending, we also get a very nuanced, twice over perspective on this environment, because we do follow the POV of Dusk, and then we also follow the POV of Starling, who is a dragon kept within the form of a human, so they have immense power within them, but it's all shackled down for reasons I won't spoil. And Sanderson, being who he is as a writer, and quite frankly, I feel like having been waiting a long time to start writing stories like these, where so much of the groundwork he's been building for decades now gets to blossom. I mean, hell, he even said he wrote this book in the foreword just because he couldn't get it out of his head and he really wanted to step in this direction without spoiling too much. I can feel the excitement he has for truly realizing the sci-fantasy potential of his world. And so he paid so much attention to making sure that the cultural backdrops that bring these people to this place do dictate not only how they approach the conflict, but how they view everyone around them. From our network intelligence to our chained dragon to our native speaking with magical birds to our skeletons, everything is so vivid in terms of there's no mustache twirling evil, there's just political opportunists. There is no uprising or rebellion, but there's a desire to remain true to who you are. And then finally, from Starling's perspective, we don't get a scoundrel who's trying to undercut the system. And in a very refreshing choice, we just get someone who is overwhelmingly optimistic, and that is their strongest trait as a character. And while I didn't love Starling as a whole, it was nice, especially after reading a whole bunch of Adrian Tchaikovsky recently, to see someone whose greatest strength was just being willing to view the best outcome, to believe in themselves and those around them, with some outside influence from a character any Cosmere fan will recognize, and I'll leave it at that. And so I ended up liking this story for a whole bunch of different reasons. It did not overstay its welcome, had a great pace, an interesting conflict, a well set up cast of characters, contained to an environment that, while being rich for exploration of this era of the Cosmere, never felt like it was some kind of cataclysmic Stormlight Archive-esque stakes, and instead just tied into the personal desires and wishes of the cast of characters we're following. You could also feel Sanderson's excitement to tell a smaller story like this that felt like a crew on a ship just trying to not get tied up in the tractor beam, to kind of give an obvious Star Wars-esque example. And I'm not just talking about the raw cool parts where we're seeing certain bits of technology develop. I'm just gonna say mild spoiler warning for just a cool thing. We see not a shard plate, not a shard blade, which never, again, especially with like the huge evil snake monster in the shadows, Sanderson's able to pull off raw cool with the best of the fantasy genre. I wish his prose could aid him in his execution a little bit from time to time here, but his ideas are so palpably awesome. That was And so for last minute thoughts, it's a testament to how solid the foundations of the Cosmere are that Isles of the Emberdark is able to just leap into this crossover setting where there are multiple hard magic systems having to develop and work with technology. And instead of feeling taxing because we're all hardcore Cosmere fans, we're just able to hit the ground running without having to slow down and spend too much time just ruminating on some world building, because while there is just the notes to make sure you remember what you absolutely have to, in general, we're just running, and that's so much fun. And it feels like Sanderson, who's at his best when he's having fun, is truly telling the type of story that he's been excited to get to in the Cosmere for so long. And with all this free, just pump up lore and epic feeling coming in from the foundations that were literally laid down by fantasy epics, Isles of the Emberdark, it just feels like this charming medium scale story fitting perfectly into one of the most epic settings currently developing in sci-fi or fantasy and moving in to dominate the sci-fantasy space. I mean, I guess that's going to be the big three of sci-fantasy going forward: Warhammer, Star Wars, and Cosmere, though correct me if there's a franchise I'm forgetting there that's equally as big at the moment.
Fuck the big three, nigga, it's just big me, nigga, boom.
Couple more just subjective things. please stop with the Marvel talk. I know Sanderson deep down within him can write some good, serious dialogue in climactic moments. I know he's done it in Stormlight Archive. Speaking of epics that help set up this world, it just doesn't fit as smoothly when in this same universe we're suddenly getting these quips instead of meaningful, impactful words at these crucial moments. And to me, it just feels, not think. I want to make that the focus word there. Kind of forced. I don't feel like this stuff is meant to be there, and I'm not sure why it's continually put in, except for maybe trying to appeal to an audience. I don't know. And then last, and maybe least, because this is the most subjective point of all time, I just don't find Sanderson that funny still. I know that is just the most, personal preference point ever, and I'll never actually knock a book down a point unless the humor is overtly extremely lazy. But the dynamics Sanderson tries to set up for comedic beats between characters, I usually find to just be a bit corny or already played out, and then the overt jokes just don't even typically get a from me. Though I know there are plenty of people who do find him funny, so that is purely a me thing. Sorry, please excuse the Wheel of Time drawings we're cooking over on Patreon. Smooth plug. This Cold War backdrop that seems to be happening between the two main worlds we follow within the Cosmere is so interesting. I never ended up caring more about the characters than that conflict, than the potential of the Cosmere, but I didn't dislike anybody, and I especially enjoyed the overall arc we got for Six of Dusk. His development around ideas of what is useful versus important, serving a society, or finding fulfillment within self, with so much going on and so many characters to juggle, really managed to be the heart of this story for me. But at the same time, because of the implications we're getting for the wider Cosmere, this story also successfully planted a whole bunch of seeds to get me all the more hyped to see where Stormlight's next leg goes, or where the Mistborn societies develop. So yeah, I'm feeling a really solid 7 out of 10, closer to an 8 than a 6 for sure. And it's just because everything here was good. I liked this optimistic view in an environment that had a realistic understanding of what will drive factions in the future of the Cosmere. Sanderson's stories have been very up and down with me recently, but he continues to rope me back in successfully. I hope we continue to see that leaned into for the future. I think the utilizing of these smaller stories to have readers get informed on what is to come on the larger scale is a genius storytelling move for the hardcore fans to be able to theorize, speculate, and feast, while exercising some lower stakes stuff comparatively for the Cosmere, and show a side of Sanderson's writing that feels more restrained, but as a result is all the more tantalizing. It's just a recipe for success. But let me know what you think of Isles of the Emberdark in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. We're going to be doing some more quickie book reviews over on the second channel if you're interested in more of these types of videos from me. Just books that I don't feel like I have as much to say about. We recently did The Wandering Inn Redux, as well as Magic Bites, which was a really fun urban fantasy book to check on out. So head on over there if you'd like to see more of my face, and have a good one, y'all. Peace.